Okay, good evening, everyone. This is our last lecture before we do quiz number 3. I'm going to stick mostly to things related to chapter 4. As I messaged this afternoon and posted on our website, the all the content is from chapter 4. Plus, I did add a lot of material. This chapter probably includes more extra material than any other part of the book. Chapter 3 is very long and pretty thorough, and chapter 4 needs some serious editing and needs to be developed a little bit better from the early part of the settlements and the colonies. So don't forget, you do have to know, the general characteristics of the 13 colonies and the relationship with the British and the things I talked about in class and the previous cyber lecture. But today, these are the things you must know, the basic things about the creation of the United States. That anybody who wants to understand American history has to start with. This is not going to give you the complete picture, but even today, with the current president, and any president really, there's a struggle over what the Constitution means, and that document was made after the war was fought. For our purposes, the Declaration of Independence is a little bit more important because that's what starts the conflict that leads to this separation, permanent separation. And this is a culture class, and we're mostly interested in how American culture is similar and different from the British. So as I told you, certain colonies were really trying to be as British as possible, like Virginia, and certain colonies like Massachusetts or Georgia. Massachusetts was trying to be a Puritan state. Pennsylvania was trying to be a brotherhood of sort of religious freedom. Georgia was trying to be a free state and then ended up being a slave state. So over the 100 years or so of benign neglect, remember that term for the quiz, where they were left alone, they started to develop their own cultures without, other than the states that wanted to, have a British sort of imperial culture. They loved their tea. They loved their British newspapers. They respected the king. But they valued their freedom more than any of those things. So that, the first lecture I recorded after the midterm, remember those 5 American values, not just for this quiz, but for the exam, that those ideas are going to repeat. And we're going to see, right now, we're going to see if American culture is changing, because that is the title of the book, Evolution and Revolution. And up until now, everything I have said is in the past. And every day, things are changing, and we'll see how strongly, American values are defended, and whether they get compromised. And I think one of the important things is to know that some of the things that are happening now, and I'll stay away from people's names as much as possible, but it is Donald Trump who's the president right now, and he's the leader of a movement. He's not the only person. I tend to always blame him for everything, which is not fair. If it was just him, he would not be president. There are millions and millions of people that agree with him. So it's an entire movement, the MAGA, Make America Great Again movement. And it sort of starts with this lie I'm going to say that Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And for that to be the case, I mean, there are three principles, essentially, the natural rights of man. The French helped the Americans fight the British and win the war. We talked about George Washington. Sometimes he won, sometimes he lost, but he never gave up. And as a consequence, the British gave up, but he refused. He was beatable, but not in the long term. I guess he was the word is, I guess, dauntless. He was. You would have to just completely wipe him out, get rid of him and every person he had to fight with before he would give up. He's a sort of super committed general, even though he did lose battles. So the principles that sort of lie behind all of these ideas are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? If you haven't heard, I'm assuming most of you have probably heard these things. Liberty is right there, freedom, but everybody has the right to these things. And I can't get into the details too much, but right now there's some question as to whether the government in America is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which this is why this course is important, because what the heck is the habeas corpus? Well, that's Magna Carta material. Habeas corpus means that you have the right to a trial, and if the king's going to kill you, he has to give a reason, right? If the government's going to kidnap you and send you to another country or arrest you or take away your freedom, right? Limit your ability to get a job or to have an education or where you live or anything. If the government, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was kind of like the evolution of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta happened in 1215. The rich people were like, we are not going to let King John stomp all over us and do whatever he wants. So let's make this document. King John signed it and then immediately, changed his mind. Does that remind you of a president? I don't know if you watch the news, but there is a lot of changing their mind and saying yes and agreements and then breaking agreements, and nobody knows what's going on. This is exactly the problem with King John in the 13th century, is that the Kingdom of England was a mess because nobody knew what King John was going to do. Is he going to attack France? Is he going to steal somebody's wife? Is he going to kill somebody because he's in a bad mood? Is he going to tax people that don't deserve to be taxed? 100 years later, 150 years later, after the Black Death, the peasants get angry and they're like, we don't want to be restricted. We don't want to be limited in where we have to work, and we want to be able to, we don't want to be overtaxed, and we don't want to be conscripted to go to fight wars in France that we're losing, and we want to be able to earn as much as we want, and we don't want to be restricted in where we have to live, right? Habeas corpus is this a fundamental right of any human being in America, which now includes everyone, which protects individuals from abuse, from the government, from the president, the police, Justice Department, and so on. You take that away and you don't have legal protection from people doing things to you that threaten your life, your liberty, or your right to. Pursuit of happiness is a very general kind of abstract idea, but it's supposed to include opportunity, right? America is the land of opportunity. Anybody has a chance to succeed. If you're, it doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. If you work hard, you should be given a chance to succeed. And when people take that wrongfully, right? If you do crime and you do things that damage society or other people or property, those are crimes and you should be punished. But otherwise, nobody should be able to take that from you. However, built into the Constitution is this idea that anybody who is a native person or a slave actually native people don't even get to vote. This is a very strange thing, I know, but slaves, which by slaves I'm talking about African American slaves, but there are slaves from various places, and West Africa is the most common place, but there can be slaves that are from different countries and different backgrounds. Just most of them are from West Africa, and they end up in South America, in the Caribbean, and in America. There was slaves in Canada too, so we're not innocent either. Just the number was very small. Most of the slaves went to South America. Most of them, the Portuguese were the great slave traders of the period, and Brazil was the recipient of the majority of the slaves. But millions of slaves made it to America. But certainly there was thousands of slaves in Canada, so Canadians are not innocent of this. Just by the time the American Civil War happens, Canada is part of the British Empire and slavery is illegal, so Canada becomes this place where slaves can run to. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have a history of mistreating African people before about 200 years ago, around the time that America became a country. Shortly after that, slavery became, in the early 1800s, slavery became illegal in the British Empire, but was legal in the U.S. until 1863, when, in the middle of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, but not actually free. It depends on what I think African American professor you ask, but maybe not really free until into maybe the 1960s when Martin Luther King, like that's the late date, is that there's segregation and there's racial discrimination, just not brutal plantation slavery after the Civil War. So this is a problem because gradually the southern states say, we're not going to be in Virginia and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Those are the big slave states. They say, we're not going to join. We're not going to be in the United States if slavery is not allowed, right? So, and Thomas Jefferson himself is a slave owner, and so is George Washington. And I said George Washington let his slaves go when he died, but Thomas Jefferson instead, when his wife died, had a slave girlfriend whose children she had with him remained slaves, because that was the law, that the children of slaves remained slaves, which I can't explain that. You make your own decision about Thomas Jefferson. I always, until I made this book and taught this class, I always thought Thomas Jefferson was someone you you would respect as a important part of the creation of America as a democratic country that eventually developed and evolved and had revolutions and wars to fight for freedom to the point where, it benefited. I mean, I grew up thinking that. And once I learned about the personal details about Thomas Jefferson, I'm really not so sure. He sounds like a bit of a hypocrite. The fact of the matter is that only people who were like the way that voting worked is that you only got to be a representative if you owned some property or you had enough money to be eligible. So poor people couldn't vote. It didn't matter what you looked like, whether you were a native person or a white person or a black person or man or woman. The first qualification was the fact that you had enough money. The idea was that if you had property and you had money, then you had a reason to be invested in the nation, and that you would vote according to what would be beneficial for the nation because you were invested in the nation. We all know that there's a little bit of a problem with that. Rich people vote for things that help themselves but don't help the rest of the people in the country. So gradually, anybody, the women's vote, African Americans voting was suppressed, but they were allowed to vote from the Civil War in the North. Women were started to be able to vote in 1918. So, I mean, this is only 100 years or so that women are allowed to vote at all, right? Regardless of what they look like and how much money they have. So originally there's really just a small percentage of people who are allowed to vote, but although you would call this an oligarchy, right? Like in Russia, all the rich people control the country. You call it an oligarchy, but at the same time, this sets the groundwork because there's so much land and there's so much opportunity in America that rapidly, the expansion of the United States, this expansion, buying land from France and then fighting Mexico. We'll talk about this later in the Civil War, but buying land from Mexico, it makes the United States 5-6 times bigger overnight. These are huge amounts of land, and they are selling them cheaply, and in some cases they're just granting land to people. And once you have a farm, Thomas Jefferson, and this is why I thought he was a good guy, is of the mind that once you have a farm and once you have land, just like the Romans, you are a citizen farmer and you are a participant in the nation, and that gives you the right to vote because you're a contributing citizen, to the society, economically, structurally, potentially. You can fight in defense of your country, and you should be allowed to vote. So the number of people starts to expand, and the area starts to expand, and the economy starts to grow. After the war, they win against the British, but they're incredibly dependent on British trade. So they do have this kind of tariff war thing that happens. It's not as crazy as what we're doing right now, but tariffs were a normal thing hundreds of years ago. So all of a sudden, the United States are not in the British Empire anymore, so they have no choice. All those taxes, the salt tax or the stamp tax or the sugar act, or the tea or anything else. Now the British are going to say, if you don't pay, we're not bringing you the stuff. We're not trading with you. So actually, um, even though the French helped them and they're supposed to be friends with French, the irony is that they don't have a very strong connection with the French economy, and they have like a very developed dependent relationship with the British. So the British they don't have to pay for the United States, they don't have to pay for soldiers, they don't have to pay for a war, they don't have to pay for government buildings or anything. The American citizens, brand new American citizens, have to pay for everything themselves. So the taxes go up. I mean, they fought a war, some of them, because they didn't want to pay taxes, mostly because they believed that they were being underrepresented and that they deserved to have their own nation, and that they were patriotic. But there was a huge mix of people, and some of the people just left. They're called the Loyalists, and in the decade, in the 1780s and 1790s, tens of thousands of Americans moved to Canada. And the reason they moved to Canada, because it's not Canada, it's British North America. When they move there, they remain British. They don't want to be American. So there's this exodus of people. And if they stay, I mean, all the rebels and the Americans are going to treat them badly because they think, they were traitors. They were on the wrong side. So there's this big immigration that happens, which ends up balancing the population of English and French people in British North America, in Canada. So you end up with having a British English population that can control the French population in Canada, for better or for worse. But over time, I mean, the French and the English in Canada have had many problems, but over time they gradually, I think, have forgiven each other for some of those things that happened a long time ago, and have developed together to become a country. And without the French, Canada just wouldn't be Canada. But back to what happens. This is a huge contradiction. Saying everybody's free, but everybody's not free, it doesn't make any sense. That's saying yes and no at the same time. That's why your assignment next week is called An American Contradiction. Slavery is the greatest example of that. This is not allowed as a topic because this is the best example, and you have to find your own example. So nobody's writing on slavery. Let me make that clear. No assignments on slavery. Okay? This affects the development of the states, economically and socially. There's more black people. There's more people from immigrating to become slaves from West Africa than there are white people in the South. In some cases, they're starting to be outnumbered, 3 or 4 to 1. We're talking like, for 1 million white people or 2 million white people, there's 5 or 6 million. This is later, closer to the Civil War, but this is what's happening. It's the population of slaves is skyrocketing. And there's a few masters that hold all the money and all the power, and the society is dominated by slaves. It is quite similar to what the Roman Empire starts to become. I know probably most of you didn't study Roman history, but this is what the Roman Empire was. They conquered other places, and human labor is expensive, and if you can capture slaves and they do work for free, this can be much more productive than the system they had before in the Republic, which was Thomas Jefferson's idea. Even though he had slaves, took advantage of it and made money from that system. Ideally, what he wanted was a country of citizen farmers, which he believed that the Greeks and the Romans, that's what the heart of like the Western Republic is the nuclear family unit with a capable agricultural system that can be economically and socially stable. Didn't work that way. Most people were just trying to make as much money as possible. It ended up being cotton that was the most valuable crop. So that's what it started to work towards. But that's some of that stuff is in the next chapter. So what you really need to know, what you really need to do is read in the book about slavery and America and shackles, and read about all that stuff, because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, because slavery is going to basically continue for another 4 generations or so, maybe 5 generations. It lasts a long time. 1620 until now is 400 years, and the slaves were freed kind of in the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln, but that would still put, the first slaves in America came in the 1620s. So we got 400 years, going back to 1865, the end of the Civil War is about 100. So 250 years of slavery and 150 years after that, which most of that time there was still a lot of discrimination against the people who, resembled slaves just by appearance. So there's reasons for it. There's huge consequences. The Civil War, there are people that say when the Constitution is written after the war is over, they're saying this document is going to start a war. It's not stupid people or unaware people. It's not prophetic. It's not magic. There's reasonable politicians are just saying, we just made a document that is at some point going to rip the country in half. And they were 100% right, because that's what's going to happen. So that's going into, we're going to talk about imperialism first, but then we'll come back to talk about the Civil War. We're going to talk about the Native people. We're going to talk about the Civil War and the Native people in chapter 5, and then we're going to talk about imperialism in chapter 6. So we'll see where we are at that point. But for this is just this quiz is just up until right here, the end of chapter 4. Stop on page 150, and we'll do quiz number 3, and then we'll work on chapter 5 and 6 after that. So major points, the discovery of America, the Columbian Exchange, the colonies and their different sort of cultures that develop independently and without British imperial interference. The war with France that causes France to go bankrupt and the British to try and get more money from the colony, and Benjamin Franklin being insulted and Thomas Jefferson writing this important document that starts the process of the war, and George Washington fighting the war and becoming the first president. The first 5 presidents of the United States are from Virginia, so that gives you an indication. Unlike now, where California would be easily the most powerful economic and cultural state in the United States, Virginia was Virginia. Biggest population, most important individuals politically, and militarily, oldest colony, etc. That they're basically number 1 in every category. So Virginia is really, it's when Virginia does something, it has a sort of outsized effect. Once the United States grows, Virginia is going to rapidly become less and less important. Until right now, you probably don't know very much about Virginia. But in the beginning, it was the most important state, and that's where Jefferson and Adams and George Washington and the first 5 presidents lived. So, not surprising, Virginia was a slave state. Presidents had slaves themselves and were living in a slave state. So once the presidents started being from different states, for example, Abraham Lincoln, who is, I think he's born in Tennessee or Kentucky, but anyway, he represents Illinois, and he represents the North. And once you get presidents who are not from the slave states, then you start to have more and more friction about what should be done about slavery, and whether it's economically it's an economic necessity, whether it's necessary economically, socially, and ethically. Of course, it's a terrible crime. One of the worst crimes against humanity in the last 1,000 years. So there's no getting around that. Just we need to learn about it and understand it and look at it, analyze it so that we can avoid these sort of things, occurring again. Protect human rights and protect people's diversity and political rights, natural rights, human rights. All these things are very important things that people are debating in when the United States becomes a country, and they continue now to be debated. So we got to, stay on top of that information and make sure that we understand that we shouldn't let people take those rights away from us, because then our lives will slowly be restricted to the point where we are becoming slaves again, right? Anyway, study your chapter 4, get ready for the quiz, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you for listening.